much, Terry, and thanks for the invitation. One of the things I often ask myself, and a lot of people say, well, how many, I mean, in terms of the safety feature, we talk about safety, and one of the questions I've often asked myself is how many cyclists have died since what we call the cycling boom. That was about 1971. And the question, in fact, was put by Joan Doiron. Some of the older ones here might know who Joan was. She was a school board trustee. She worked for one of the councillors, Alan Sparrow, who was a real leader in the pushing for cycling. So she said, and this was in 1984, she said, talking about the City Cycling Committee, she said, "The City Cycling Committee is always under service. In theory, the city is supportive, but in practice, little is done. How many people have to get killed before we do something?" she asked. And so in fact I've looked at the numbers. So the answer is we have about 1 kilometer of bike lane for each cyclist that's been killed over the last, since the cycling boom in 1971. So we've built about 120 kilometers of bike lanes, and we've had at least 120 cyclists that have been killed in that time. And that shows you how little we've done to make cycling safe in this city, and how long we've been talking about it without actually doing anything about it. So one of the things I would say in terms of the bike lane, like we know the bike lane is very successful, and we only have to look at the waves of cyclists that use the bike lane. We did a count in September and found there were about 6,100 cyclists in a 24-hour period. So that was an increase from the last count that had been done prior to the bike lane, which was about 3,400. So a dramatic increase in the number of cyclists. And I don't think you actually have to do a count. You just have to look at the waves of cyclists in the morning. It's so impressive. In fact, we counted cyclists this morning between 8 and 9, and we're still 200. This is in the middle of January, 200 cyclists per hour, or at least in the hour we counted during rush hour. The other thing, of course, we know the bike lane went in mid-August, so that count that we did in September was just a month after it was installed. And we know, of course, that bike lanes, especially separated bike lanes, the studies have shown they're safer. And what we know about Bloor Street is that we've largely removed one of the worst dangers, which is being doored. Either because partly there's a separated bike lane, and partly because where you do have to cycle beside cars, it's on the passenger side, which should make it a bit safer in terms of being doored. So I would say whether or not we leave the bike lane in is not actually going to be about the numbers. It's really going to be about values. And I would say the value that we're always quickest to sacrifice is safety. And the reason I believe that we're so quick to do it is because we're not willing to question something else that we think should have to be very highly valued, which is the right of one person to drive in one car any time of the day to any place in the city without question. So we don't question that. So we don't actually put it in those terms, but we make arguments. They're very common arguments against bike lanes. And I want to demonstrate how weak those arguments are that we generally make against bike lanes. So the first one, which is one of my favorites, which is that they'll say, well, this is a seasonal argument, so bike lanes aren't used in the winter. And the reason the gist of that argument is that bikes use space inefficiently. So this is the auto lobby saying, bikes use space inefficiently, right? And really everyone should fall down laughing when they hear that, when the auto lobby makes that argument, because there is, of course, no machine, probably in our history, that has squandered space more frivolously and more monstrously than cars. And of course, we know we could look at all the road space, and that's a good example, but I want to give you another example that we often don't think about. So the average car needs, at any given time, for every car, there are about 4 parking spaces, right? For every car. It's actually probably more than that. Some estimates say it's up to 8 spaces. So for every car, there are 4 parking spaces. And if it's a curbside space, that's about 130 square feet. And if it's in a parking garage, it's about 330 square feet, because you need the access lanes. So by comparison, so that in terms of numbers then, the average car will then need between 520 square feet and 1,320 square feet. That's just for parking. So this past year, my wife and I, we lived for a time in a condo in Ottawa. We had 600 square feet. We lived very comfortably, 2 people. So that's not even enough to park a car for a day. That's not enough. So, and it's also surface space that we're generally talking about. So when it comes to cars, that argument that it's bicycles that don't use space efficiently, we should always laugh at that argument and really be quite sympathetic to people making that argument, because it's such a ridiculous argument, but one that's often made. So the second argument we often hear is that it's the loss of car parking on Bloor is hurting local business. And as soon as any business says, I think I'm losing business because of the parking, because of the bike lane. And Ramona had a good one today. She said, oh, the video store said I think we're losing a couple $100 a week or whatever because of the bike lane. Well, of course it wouldn't be Netflix that has affected a store like that. And the other thing to remember is, we're losing it's about 100 parking spots or maybe less that have been lost. But those 100 parking spaces actually represent only about less than 10% of the total parking in the area. The first block, north and south of Bloor, if you count those parking spaces, are about 1,200, either in green P lots or in free side street parking. So the amount of parking we've lost in terms of what's available is quite small. But remember, of course, this is all in the context of the fact that businesses get about 10% of their business from motorists. So 10% of patrons arrive by car, which is about the same as the number by bicycles. So even the worst case scenario is that a business would lose 10% of its business. But that ignores, of course, the fact that we've got so many more cyclists in the area. We have a lot more parking for bicycles. And I think for a lot of business, the answer is, well, why aren't you going after those cyclists and asking them to come into your business instead of saying, oh, I think the bike lane is hurting my business. And the other point to remember, of course, is, and I was talking to a local business person recently, he's got a small shop, so his rent went up per month by about $1,500 last year. And he says, that's essentially, that could be my salary. So when people complain about the bike lane, well, there are a lot of other factors that need to be considered. And I think the point is in fact, quite moot, because if you look at the number of people that will not only be accessing businesses in the near future, from Mirvish Village, for example, you have a couple of thousand people moving into there. I mean, if you really care about the parking, there would be something like 600 new parking spaces. But the point is, those people will be parked right on the doorstep of these local businesses. They won't need cars or bikes or any other device to get to these businesses. And that's what we really should be thinking about if we're looking at about planning into the future. A third point is that we often hear, and we in fact even heard this from Jay Robinson, who's the head of the city's road safety initiative. She'll say, well, we have to put bike lanes where they're reasonable, right? And well, the answer to that is a street like Bloor, which has for many years been the most popular cycling route in Toronto, and has been one of the most dangerous for cyclists. I mean, if that's not a reasonable place to put bike lanes, then there is no other place to put bike lanes. So I think that's often code for not putting bike lanes anywhere at all. And here's another thing. In 1979, they put in, on Harvard, they put in sort of a bike lane. It was more of a wide lane with signs and with street markings. And so they checked to see what the impact was on Bloor Street. And in fact, they found that during that period, 1979 to 1981, the number of cyclists on Bloor in the maximum 8-hour period increased from 700 cyclists to 1,400 cyclists. The numbers on Harvard went up as well, somewhat, but the conclusion of the Works Commissioner, his name was Bremner, he said, well, the bike lane on Harvard, people don't really like it too much, and he said, despite this sort of bike route on Harvard, cyclists still preferred Bloor Street as an east-west corridor, and that's why, and they stayed on Bloor Street. So that's even, how many years ago is that? Like 1980, 35 years ago. So that's how long this issue has been debated. But the interesting thing about Bremner, he was the Works Commissioner, he didn't say, well, it's not working on Harvard, people prefer Bloor Street, so you'd think he'd say, let's put the bike lane on Bloor Street. But all he said is, let's take it off of Harvard Street. That was his solution. And of course, the solutions we're still getting today. And then there are places we can improve the bike lane, like we've heard about infiltration, for example, into local neighborhoods. That's something we should take seriously, but there are easy answers to things like that, which is number one, maybe you should get out of your car. Instead of us saying, let's take out the bike lane, we should say to people, perhaps you should be thinking about getting out of your car. There's a recent study by Toronto Atmospheric Fund found that if people did more ride sharing, there's a dramatic decrease you could have in the amount of car traffic. But we don't say that to people. We say, well, motorists are infiltrating your neighborhood. Let's get rid of the bike lane. And that sort of shows how easily we dismiss concerns about safety. And of course, now finally, the one that we always hear as cyclists is we'll say, well, cyclists, some cyclists don't obey the rules of the road. Well, the truth is some cyclists don't obey the rules of the road. But the real question is I always try to figure out, well, what do they actually mean when they, when you talk about a bike lane, and then someone will always pipe up, what about those cyclists that, there's one that always goes through my red light or through a stop sign on my street. Well, the point is, or here's I think what they mean. Either they mean when they say that, when they bring it up in the context of infrastructure, is they say, well, because some cyclists don't obey the rules of the road, therefore they don't merit a bike lane. And I think the logical conclusion of that is, well, cyclists, it's okay for cyclists to be injured or maimed or killed because other cyclists are not obeying the rules of the road. I think that's a logical argument they're making when they say, in the context of whether you should have a bike lane, that some cyclists are not obeying the rules of the road. And I think the reason that argument is so silly is, number one, if you look at it in the context of the people making those arguments, which are often motorists, over the last century, 300,000 people have been killed on our roads in collisions, and all of those have involved motor vehicles, right? So if the argument is, you have to be really, your conduct has to be perfect in order for you to get infrastructure, then we would never widen or pave or expand our road network, if that's in fact the argument. And secondly, I don't think there's a great push to have solutions to that issue, and I think the best solution is that we should put it in our schools. We should have from grade 1 or 2, and those recommendations have been made as long as, I'm looking at you, Deborah, and your husband, probably as long as we've been talking about this issue, those recommendations have been made to improve education. And I think if you put it in the grade schools, not only does it make cycling more legitimate, not only do cyclists learn better skills, not only is there a uniformity of knowledge about cycling rules and appreciation for rules, but we'd all be better off, but cycling would become more legitimate. So I think that's why those recommendations are often ignored. That's a solution. So instead they'll say, let's license cyclists, which usually they mean let's register a cyclist. And I think our answer to that should always be, well, go ahead. Because we know it's not going to happen. Because anytime they've really proposed that, it's ineffective, it's cumbersome, and it's costly, and it's never going to happen. And if it would happen, it really should happen at the provincial level, like a driver's license. But it's not going to happen. But I think we could push for getting cycling education into schools, and then that is an answer to those critics who always come up with the idea of licensing cyclists, even though we know it doesn't work. And for example, some people say, well, then we could identify cyclists. Well, that's a silly argument as well. Number one, because the police aren't saying they can't identify cyclists. And number two, there's an obvious difference between someone sitting on a bicycle and someone sitting in a car behind enclosed in a car. So identification is not an issue. If a cyclist has disobeyed a rule and is caught, that cyclist has a legal obligation to identify him or herself. So that's usually an argument that's posed by people who really want to punish cyclists. But as I say, our answer should be, as cyclists, well, go ahead if you wanted to do it, because it's not going to happen. So finally, then, I'll simply end with that. Then I think my point being, or my thesis being, that it's not going to be about the numbers, whether the bike lane stays in or out, because in terms of the numbers, we know that the bike lane is a tremendous success. I mean, we've had 6,100 people using that bike lane, not polluting, exercising, doing all the things we want people to do, staying fit, not contaminating the atmosphere with greenhouse gas emissions. It's not going to be about the numbers, it's going to be about values. And we have to talk about safety, because our safety as cyclists is something that has to be valued greater than the right of someone to drive on their own, unencumbered by pedestrians and cyclists to drive on their own to any part of the city at any time of the day. That's really what we need to curtail, as opposed to the safety interests of cyclists. So I'll end there and pass it over to Jacqueline.